Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the TALABook program. TALABook was started last year as a forum to engage professionals in the assisted living industry with relevant topics, everything from Alzheimer's and dementia, which of course we'll be covering today, to leadership, to AI, to business topics that help improve your knowledge and your skill set to just add a little bit more to your skill set. So thank you so much for joining us today. This is estimated to be about an hour long. We are recording, and I'm excited today because we're continuing our trend of featuring Texas authors on the TALABook. That's something that we're really excited about, and we like to really do that. So we're welcoming another local Texas author today, as well as I'm shortly going to turn it over to Hollie Glover, who will be hosting today's session from the James L. West Center for Dementia Care. So we're really excited to have you all with us. A couple notes about today's format. If you have any questions at any point, please put them into the Q&A. Hollie and Pam are going to be leading the conversation today, and then I'll be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. And then at any point, if there's a time in the conversation to ask a question, I'll speak up with a question. Otherwise, we'll save time for your questions at the end. So hopefully you all enjoyed reading the book. If you didn't have time to read the book, don't worry. We'll make sure that we cover a lot of the important takeaways. So we're adding value for you here today and making sure that, you're getting some great information. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Hollie.
Great. Thank you. I'm so glad to be back again. This is exciting. I hope that you've had a chance to read this book. I was just telling Pam and Helen and Diana, I actually have used this with my caregiver support groups that I do, and they love it. So very glad that you're here. And we are just going to start our conversation. And Pam, in your opening, you tell the story of how you were introduced to dementia as a preteen. Could you briefly tell us your introduction to the disease?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I my family moved to San Antonio when I was a year old from St. Louis. So all their family and both sets of my grandparents were back in St. Louis. We would visit them 2 weeks every summer, 2 weeks every winter. They were pretty much the only older people I'd ever been around. And grandma's friends were very kind of eccentric and fun, and everybody with purple hair and shades of blue. And then this particular year, I don't know if I was 11, maybe almost 12, my dad's parents came down to visit, and my grandmother wasn't laughing and crying a lot, and there was buzzing in the room. And probably by the next morning, Grandpa was doing wacky stuff. He'd always been very quiet, very serious, and we were like in the army. He was doing orders, and his language was very, very, very colorful. My grandmother cried a lot, and anyway, that was the beginnings of realizing, because it impacted not just my grandmother, but I mean, I saw my grandfather being really funny. For me as a kid, he was doing funny stuff, but every time he did funny stuff, my dad got distraught, and my grandmother was crying. So it immediately was a family disease.
Right. And you saw from the very beginning, it impacts so much more than just the person with the disease. You mentioned a what if it were me approach mixed with a bit of common sense. Explain what you mean by that statement.
Well, I think with the what if it were me, it's looking at things not the way you see them, but looking through the eyes and the hearts of these people that are living with this disease, and kind of focusing things on, if somebody, like, I don't know, takes a muffin off of somebody's plate or out of a trash can, instead of this, like, oh my gosh, how awful, put that down. If you're looking through their eyes, to me, it's so obvious. It's that common sense. It's like they probably did it. One, they didn't know they weren't supposed to, and two, because they're probably hungry. And always focusing more on the emotions and the feelings that are behind a lot of the things that these people do or say, and not so much, that they're breaking the rules. Just what if it were me? How would I feel if somebody started yelling at me about something that I didn't even know I wasn't supposed to do.
That's perfect. Empathy. Stand in their shoes. What if this was me? It could be me.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
love that you said, look at the feelings and the emotions, not necessarily the words or the actions. What are the feelings and the emotions? I know that we teach about all behavior has meaning. Behavior is communication. We try to say expressions. Expressions are communication.
Well, and I think I've always taken that one step further because that's, kind of growing up as we were learning. Because I started back in the, mid 70s. You know, it was always that it's a form of communication, but that kind of means very little. But when I do training on communication with family caregivers or support group, I always say instead of saying why are they doing this, then we should be saying what are they thinking. So
Great. So why was it important for you to include humor in the book? And there's lots of humor. Why was that important?
I think because that is a key ingredient, I feel like, for survival for a caregiver. I mean, if you can't find a reason to laugh, they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it through this. This is not. Um, we just have to find the humor, and whether it's from something that we did really goofy or what were we thinking, when we misspoke or did something that was just ridiculous. And even sometimes things that they do. I mean, it can be humorous, but we need to like hold off our laughter and share it in the support group, not be laughing there in front of them. But when we're laying in bed that night and we can't think because we're still listening, then we can think about it was like, and it's always much funnier later than it was in that moment. So, but it is a key to survival for caregivers. Absolutely.
That's one of my favorite parts of the book is the humor. As I told you earlier, I just came out of support group and we were laughing in there. We were laughing over things that if we were doing it out just with the regular people be looking at us kind of odd, but in that very safe place. And again,
Yeah.
any of you who run support groups, great book to use with support groups. And we talk about we can't cry 24/7.
Yes.
But boy,
Yeah.
with this disease, we could. We can't. We've got to laugh.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, I want to share part of a paragraph from chapter 1 that I personally love, and I borrowed it on occasion. I love this. It's like boiling a frog in water. According to the story, if a frog is placed in cold water on the stove, it senses no danger or reason to hop out. As the water slowly heats up, the frog gradually adjusts. By the time the water begins to boil, it's already too late. Would you please explain why you included this anecdote?
Well, I don't know when I had heard it. It was probably a cajillion years ago. But, you know, caregivers are always saying, I'm just fine. And I think they really are just fine until one moment they're suddenly not. And I've always said, I felt personally that the worst thing and why this is the most terrible disease, worse than any other, is the duration. It just goes on and on and on and on. And I think that's what happens to caregivers. In the very beginning, they really are just fine. It's kind of an inconvenience. It's not overwhelming. It can be annoying, but it's not devastating. And they just keep acclimating until finally, I've said in support groups, it's like you end up just like the frog. The frog does not have a happy ending to a story. And certainly as professional caregivers, we've seen that all too often too. And many of placements when I was in nursing homes, a lot of placements in the nursing home came not from the primary caregiver. It came from another family member because the caregiver had either died or they were in the hospital dealing with heart attacks or nervous breakdowns or all kinds of things. So I don't know. I think families can relate to the story a bit more than saying, you need to ask for help sooner. So that's why I included it.
I think so too. I just love it. And it's another one of those places where we can laugh a little bit. We can, and then go, wait a minute. Oh, I see what that means here. Again, something that I use a lot, talking with caregivers about taking care of themselves, that comes through over and over in this about, because the caregiver, that's what we do as caregivers, professional and personal caregivers. And then there's those of us that are both. We pour out to everybody else, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the messages that I found myself saying a lot this year to families, because one of the messages with current presentations I'm doing is talking about, where's my village, and kind of ensuring that they do have a village. And when a family member kind of pipes up in his partner me, it's like, oh, I'm fine, and we're going to do just fine, and blah, blah, blah. One day it just sprouted out, and I said, let me be very honest with you. If you do not have a plan for your wellness and have a plan for support, then you need to make plans for your replacement. And the family member that was saying that, they were kind of like, oh my gosh. And I said, I'm serious, because if you do not plan now for wellness, both yours and the person you love, somebody else will make those plans and make those decisions that may or not be the same decisions that you would have liked to have made.
I love that. I'm writing it down. Plan your replacement. Wow,
Yeah.
that's powerful.
It is powerful.
You're saying it in a compassionate way.
Well, compassionate goes both ways, for us as a caregiver and how we're caring for that person entrusted to us. But I think also that we need to, as professionals, care just every bit as much for those family caregivers.
We have to. And I love you mentioned duration. With the Olympics being on right now, this has come up a lot the last couple of weeks, where I actually have had family members drawing and going, we're not on a sprint. This is a marathon. It's like, dang, it is. That relates right to this.
Well, I think not only is it a marathon, but it's in a marathon where somebody keeps kind of moving the finish line. Just when we think we're getting close, it just keeps moving and moving.
I love it.
Which is even worse.
Way to put it. Great way to put it. And it's a marathon where we're going through grief. It's a marathon where we're getting hit with these feelings and emotions. Where's that coming from? And we just kind of settle again. Bam, our loved one changes, and we're on the journey with them.
Yes.
Oh, love that. I love that. Plan for our replacement. That's good. Okay, I'd like to take a moment and have you talk us through a moving segment of the book when your happy-go-lucky dad turned to you and said, don't you remember I have Alzheimer's? Tell us about that and what transpired after he used those words to you. That was powerful. Please kind of walk us through that.
Well, it was a very powerful moment that kind of spoke to me. It was almost like God was shaking the car and say, lift up. For so many years, and I think as caregiver or professional caregivers, especially, so often we get frustrated with family members. It's like, they'll say something and we're like, what is it? Why can't you remember that they can't remember? But, so many of my frustrations with my dad came from the fact that I wasn't that professional person at that moment. I was just a daughter. I was no more. And that particular day, as soon as I said the words, don't you remember? I already felt like I couldn't feel any sadder because I knew better. I knew better. And then when my dad turned to me, and it was kind of a little drama. He turned back and he's like clearing his throat like I would know he was talking to me. And he says, don't you remember? And as soon as he said that, I'm driving down the freeway and tears are just pouring out. And I'm wiping and trying to drive. And when I got to my son's house, Kenneth came out and greeted my dad, and I went straight to the bathroom. And I was just bawling because it's like, it wasn't the first time I had said that. It wasn't the first time I had said stupid stuff. W questions don't belong with this disease. And I'm just talking to myself in the mirror, and I'm like, I can't do this again. I can't say this again. But I've always talked to families about the importance of scripting. And that's when I realized that before this has a chance to just oosh out of my mouth without me thinking, I had to have something better that would be my first line of defense. And that's when I said, did I remember to tell you? And I had said that on occasions to Dad, but my biggest problem between being a daughter and being a professional was professionally, it was real easy to be consistent with what I did and what I said, and to have my actions and words align with the right good practices. But you keep falling into, as a family caregiver, you become, the wife or the daughter-in-law, or the son, or, the spouse. And we find ourselves talking to them the way we've always spoke with them. And that's not compassionate. That's not what we need to do now. That's not how we instill dignity and respect. We have to talk differently. So that's where, did I remember to tell you? Kind of came out to be.
Yeah. That stood out. The very first time I read this book, I underlined that because I went, that was a changing point. You could tell just from the way you write it, that was a changing point. You mentioned shaking, pounding on the desk, frustration, and speaking without thinking as a caregiver. You realized that you needed to instill feelings of love, respect, and admiration. How did you go about doing this with your dad?
Well, I did a lot of derm. I know we'll talk about derm in a bit. But I think mostly just, again, kind of what I just mentioned, the importance of scripting, having, I always tell families, the good thing about this disease, if there is something good, is that if you do something wrong, you make a mistake, you misspeak, you don't speak compassionately, you say the wrong thing, you're going to have a second chance to do better the second time. So when you figure out that second chance, or seconds later, you say, I wished I would have said this, or I wished I would have said it this way, or I wished I've used a different emotion. When you know that right answer, write it down right then and just practice and let that be your script. So that script comes to mind quicker than something that's just sparked by an emotion at that moment. And my frustration consistently, again, I mentioned, I would get annoyed with my dad, but my frustrations with him were never as many or as great as the frustrations with myself as a caregiver. Because all the time in my mind, I kept thinking, I really should be the perfect caregiver. Because I know what good practices are. I know how important these things are. I know that it should be all about caring with love, dignity, and respect.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't always consistently doing that.
Oh, Pam, I'm so glad you shared that. I know with this many people on right now, professionals, but we're also personally doing this. And I wonder, I'm going to ask you if you've ever done this. So I just was in my support group, and I'll do this sometimes. I'm the daughter now. I'm not the facilitator of this group.
Yeah.
So I need to speak now because I'm getting as much out of it as the rest of them are. I'm the facilitator, but there's times I'm the daughter.
Yeah. Yeah. I think though, when you're doing support groups, I don't think it's wrong that we share. I think we have to, because again, I love the we in anything, and I found I don't do very many programs and presentations for professional caregivers. It allows me to have more time to spend with support groups and do, focus training. But my language is always we. And I think that's why it was important that the book was written as a we. It wasn't you should do this and you should do that. It's we. And whether we are professional or we are that daughter.
Right.
And I think it's comforting to families when they hear us kind of admit or show our imperfections. And I think it's important as professionals to constantly remind family members about the imperfections that we're going to encounter just because we're human.
I have found the same thing. It seems like when I do share, I've even had people say back to me, that's why I'm relating to you.
Yeah.
Because I know you didn't just read it in a book, you're living it. You didn't just study it, you're living it. So I think it's really important. I agree with you about using the we language. I like that. Pam, I'd like for you to spend a little bit of time on this next one. The chapter titled A Heartfelt Apology. That chapter, it stands out. Talk to us about that chapter.
Well, I thought it was going to be an important chapter. I mean, I think so many of us, especially I have to say, growing up in Texas, because my husband's not from Texas, you know, we didn't always say I'm sorry because it's like we messed up. We say I'm sorry you didn't understand what I was trying to tell you to our husbands or whatever it might be. But I think that's one of the most powerful things as a caregiver, those two words can be, because it's not about who's at fault or who did what. It's just, I don't know. I always say it's like the purest form of empathy. It says, I'm listening and I understand and I am sorry. Just purely, I'm sorry that this person is feeling upset with us, or that we hurt their feelings, or we did something or we didn't believe their truth. We didn't believe that someone had come in and stole their shoes last night. That we just, I don't know. I just think it's just so powerful. And I think there are so many things that we can use that line for, you know, and again, kind of the scripting, instead of, no one stole your shoes, or, I've told you you can't have your dog come live with you, or you can't get another dog because you're in assisted living. At that point in time, all that stuff, that really doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is they're upset because they can't have their dog. And why can't we just say, instead of trying to think, I'm so sorry. I know you miss having a dog. You've had a dog your whole life, haven't you? Instead of getting into these rules they don't care about. They just want somebody to relate to it. And that whole sense of loss of control, that's a biggie. And again, we can't necessarily give them back the control. We can give that perception, but we can certainly be sorry for a multitude of things that go on. And two words, it's just so simple and it's just so easy, but yet it's very, very powerful as a caregiving tool. And I think it's just a good thing to do to anybody.
Yeah. And it really goes hand in hand with validation. I mean, that's what you're describing there. We're validating. They hear enough of the no, you can't, don't. But what if we just use those words? I love it. We know their feelings and emotions are still intact. We know that. Why don't we use those words? I really like that you mentioned being from Texas and that we tend to be more, well, I'm sorry that you didn't because of what. Yes.
I know. It used to drive my husband crazy. We've been married 10 years now, so he's kind of gotten used to this gal, and yeah.
But the title is A Heartfelt Apology.
Well, yeah, and that it should be very sincere. I think if nothing else, and I've told families, when you have trouble, it's like, especially when you've got family caregivers, because you've got this history. It's not like the ones that we care for professionally. We only know them in the minute. We don't have this things they've done for 50 years that have made us crazy. Now they're doing it now, and it makes us more crazy. But the fact that we truly all can be sincerely, deeply sorry that they're having to live every day with this terrible, horrible disease, and things aren't making sense, and things are difficult, and they are challenging. And again, this is a disease they're living with through no fault of their own. And to me, that's something that's very easy to be deeply remorseful about.
Yeah. And I think you're right as far as just getting into just like we stopped using some words. What if we started to use those words? And I'm sorry, this is scary, isn't it? It is scary.
Yes.
Tell me about it.
Yes,
Instead
exactly.
of, no, you're not feeling that way. Well, yeah,
Well,
I am feeling that way.
and I think these are important messages as we work with families, whether it's through support groups and through your work as you do now, or, within their everyday lives, because family caregivers need a lot of training. We can mess up as professionals caring for a loved one, and we've got all this great training, but families, they don't study to be a caregiver. They don't take courses. They don't do clinicals to learn what to say or do differently. And they just get so frustrated. And I don't know how many times I've had families call me after doing a presentation and say, my mom keeps looking for dad, and we keep telling her, don't you remember dad died? And she was like, oh, dad died. And, they're going through this. And I'm saying that, these are the wrong questions. I think we need to guide them towards the right things to be asking or supporting. And again, think about if they're looking for their dad. To me, if they're looking for their dad or their mother, it's pretty obvious that they're not aware that their mother or husband or father, whoever is dead, or they wouldn't be looking for them. They're not stupid. They're just forgetful. And I don't know. I always say it's not about intelligence. Get families into the habit of not using the W questions. That I think that would be a big gift to them.
Good point. A heartfelt apology. If you haven't read the book, you can start right there. Honestly, it's good. You got to go all the way through, but wow, that chapter. Now tell us about, you mentioned DERM earlier. Tell us about that DIRM. What does that stand for? And then how, you've already mentioned it. You go back to it. Tell us all about that.
Well, I think before I was a family caregiver, for so many years in support groups and working with families, they would be upset, I can't, what do? I can't get my wife to put her pajamas on to go to bed. And I'm saying, like, there are no pajama pleats. Does it really matter if she's sleeping in pajamas or if she's comfortable? It doesn't matter. And, always encouraging families just to step back for a minute and say, does it really matter? But what I found, again, as just a daughter, and there were times that dad would just push my buttons, or this particular day, he was telling me that basically he was going to ask this woman to marry him and move into the house with me, and I was going to take care of both of them. That was not a situation where I could just say, does this really matter? I mean, I was like boiling. And I kept trying to ask myself the question, and it's just kind of like, ugh. And I ended up with the DERM. And that just, for me, that was a lifeline. It was so powerful. And it was something I could do real quickly. And dad would do something a little bit annoying, and I would just do like DERM. And when you say DERM, it's not a sentence, but it makes this little kind of vibration in you. It's almost impossible for anybody to DERM and not kind of smirk or smile. And it's just quick and easy. And then as I shared it with other family caregivers, it just kind of caught on like wildfire. I mean, I've come to support groups where somebody has carved out in wood or have their son make, DERM magnets to put all over the house, or make a wood carving to put, in their kitchen window. I've heard him talk about, this whole week has been just one DERM thing after another. It's just so quick, and it's just so easy. So, and it's powerful. It's another powerful.
It is. I love it. It is like I know I talk about taking the single deep breath, the difference between a reaction and a response. Add that DERM in there. I love that you mentioned the pajama pants. That comes up an awful lot, especially with kids that's newer. He won't take his boots off. He's getting his bed with his boots on. And some of the folks that have been around a little bit go, is he in the bed? When? When?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I love it. I love it. All right. And chapter 10, you talk about being a perfectionist versus being perfect as a caregiver. Tell us about
Oh my goodness. Well, for one thing, I think when you're talking in terms of being a perfectionist, you're really talking about more like intentions and goals and high standards. Versus when you're a caregiver, I don't know how many of you or how many others that are on the screen ever knew Dr. Ann Lipton. She was a neurologist. She had her own practice, but she was at UT Southwestern for quite a few years. And when I first, 10 years ago, was going to write this book, when I first started taking care of dad, it was going to be called Confessions of a Professional Caregiver, and we would have discussions about, I said, you can't be perfect. And she was like, oh yes, I've seen a lot of perfect caregivers. So I think we finally ended up, one of the last times she came in town was the reality for all of us is that a perfectionist kind of demands that of themselves and others at all times, with no excuses. And it's not that we can't be a perfect caregiver, but it's only like once in a while for maybe a moment. But consistently, we just can't do that. And you mentioned the Olympics earlier, and I will also, when I'm talking to families in support groups, I talk about how these athletes, I mean, they lived and breathed, this sport, for years before the Olympics, just to qualify to go. And then how hard, and all they did was practice, practice, practice every day. They lived and breathed it. And how many people get the gold medal out of each event? One is considered to be that perfect. And yet they step into the role.
Mhm.
And it's always amazing. It's like, do you expect yourself to be perfect in everything you do? But there's something about when they're caring for a loved one, and especially I see with adult children, they want to do everything perfect. And it's just not going to happen. And it's okay. So I tell them, throw out perfect, focus on being good enough, good enough. And if you're not quite as good today as you had wanted to be or you thought you'd be when you woke up, that's okay. Because tomorrow we have another chance and we can always just strive to be better tomorrow. So I don't know.
That's
It's
good.
it's reality.
Yeah,
It's reality of being a human being, you
it
know.
is. It is. Uh, and I tell people, I'm sure you do too, that you didn't know what you didn't know.
That's
So we have to, because caregivers spend so much time beating themselves up, but you didn't know what you didn't know. You mentioned this earlier, caregivers develop a skill set they never intended, they didn't want it. Family caregivers, now, if we chose to go into the field, but a family caregiver, this wasn't the plan.
that's right.
And they'd have to develop, they really have to develop a skill set that they didn't want in the first place. I've had people say, I'm sure you have to, but I've done everything in your trainings. I've done everything. Why is it?
Well, but I always tell them, unfortunately, there isn't any one answer that fits all. And if we find an answer that fits, it's not going to fit the duration. It's going to fit for now and for a little while.
Yeah.
And then we're just constantly changing and changing and changing again. I had a quote at the very beginning of the book that I had intended to use from almost before I started writing. And then I couldn't get permission to use it. And at the last minute, my husband said, just write something, just write a little poem. And that's the one I did about the tree, because it's just, I'd already had the cover, and it just tend to fit that it's the tree is still a tree every day, but it never has the same number of leaves on it. And rarely are all the leaves exactly the same or the same color. But a tree is still a tree. It's just simple. And I think sometimes things can be more simple than we make them because there's just so many other factors and variables going on.
And we're going to do the final question, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. If you have questions, please go ahead and make sure that those get put in that Q&A. Talk us through the mind over matter situations. Give us some examples of this, mind over matter situations.
Well, we mentioned like pajamas is a mind over matter. Somebody deciding that like chop suey can be finger food. Um, I mean, there's so many every single day, but it's like if we focus on, going back to the does it really matter? Who does it matter to? Does it matter to them? Or is it something that just matters to us and it shouldn't matter because those things are not as important as what we are doing to focus on love and respect and dignity and kindness. That needs to be what always matters, what is most important, not something that we think, in our mind is important at that moment. And I think kind of focusing too on the fact that, you know, usually the mind over matter kind of starts coming into place because of a frustration where you can't fix it for family members. You can't fix it. You can't make it better. You can't make it stop. You can't make it go away.
Mhm.
But without a doubt, the greatest frustration is always going to be from trying to control something that is just uncontrollable. And this disease is not something that can be controlled. They can't manage it, but we can manage our response we can manage our reactions, our words. We can be mindful that we always want to do our best to make sure that our words and actions are really in alignment with what's in our heart. We do care about these people deeply, even if we didn't have a good relationship with my dad. I mean, my dad was the greatest guy in the whole world, and I loved him so much. And every time I would start to get a little bit upset, it's like I would say, this is not his fault. This is not his problem. This is my problem. And I can't make it better, but I can do things to make him feel better. I can do things to make him laugh or to smile. Or, towards the end, when my dad was dying, he didn't even know who I was, which it never occurred to me because I was an only child and dad and I were so close. I thought I was kind of be that exception. But I was someone that was there that was doing something kind, whether it was touching him on the cheek or his hand, or helping him in a way that didn't make him feel like he was being dependent, but made him still feel like he had some control, that he was still an adult, very deserving of love and respect. So
Yes, and
that's
the
kind of,
way that you close it, even where you're talking about truly matters, is love, kindness, respect, and acceptance.
yeah.
I know I've got a sign here in my office that says, the person with dementia is not giving you a hard time. The person with dementia is having a hard time.
That's a great. I need to write that down for the next book I'm working on. That's
I put
that's
it in
really,
a frame, so I look at it all day. And when people come in, that's what they see. And boy, does that go back to when you were talking about banging or being mad. If we can take, and then also I'll say this an awful lot. I have a 3-pound brain. Let's remind ourselves, we have the 3-pound brain. Our filter is still working.
yeah, yeah.
They're giving us a hard time. They're having a hard time. Is there
But
anything
but
else
it's
you'd like to
again, I think it goes back to, most of my frustrations were not, there were times that dad would kind of push my button and do stories, but by far my biggest frustration was not remembering that he can't remember, not remembering the limitations. My husband, one time when dad was in the hospital, he said, it's a shame that they don't give everybody with dementia like a purple ball cap, because people come in and they're asking him all these questions, and it's got on his chart, but nobody reads that. They just read the reason for being in the hospital.
Mhm.
And I said, yeah, I said, and maybe they would have to wear it all the time, because there's not that cast on the arm or crutches or anything to remind us that they're not the same. There's nothing outwardly. So I don't know.
You can't see it. You can't see it.
No, you can't see it. You cannot see the broken brick.
If only it were so easy that we could all sort of not advertise, but communicate clearly, like, this is what I'm working with and this is the limitation, or, this is the, not necessarily limitation, but this is the set of, parameters in which I function. It reminds me of that quote, that like everyone's going through something, and you just don't know necessarily what it is.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is one of the big takeaways that I got out of your book, is to just kind of, and certainly like Hollie was saying, towards the end, and you have, that whole part about, chapter 22, the power of praise and compliments as well, and just having these little moments of gratitude and the importance of gratitude. And there's a quote in there as well about how gratitude is kind of like the foundation for all these other emotions. It's not like a separate emotion, it's the foundation for all these other emotions. I thought that was a really interesting concept as well. Do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I found that to be really helpful to me, because and that's where I was able to draw professionally. I knew how this was, I knew the outcome of this disease and that it was not going to be happy ending. And I talked a lot, but my dad could really out talk anybody. And when you've been in empty nest, or you've been by yourself, and suddenly, you're blow drying your hair and you're trying to get ready, you've got someone talking to you from the moment they wake up until after they go to sleep. You can still hear them talk. It's easy to kind of get a little bit annoyed. But I started giving myself by relief to say, one of these days he's not going to have words. One of these days they're going to be too few. And every time he would do something, like the walker, anybody that's ever had a family member that has to use a walker or a crutch, you're always like, where's your walker? Where's your walker? And it was scary to me at first because I knew what would happen if he fell again. And, he was supposed to be using the walker because of a broken back. And, but I would just say, excuse me, Dad. And I would step into the other room and it's like, at least I'm glad he can still walk. I'm grateful that he can still walk. And I would just have to take those 2 moments out to remind me and to put things back in perspective that no matter how bad it is, and even at the very, very, very end, when he didn't know me and I would be sitting there, it's like, at least I know I'm here. And at least I can be grateful that he is still with me, even though it's not the same way. But I do believe that there's always, always, always something in our life to be grateful for, no matter how bad the day or the situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Reframing it. And that's what you were
Yeah.
doing, reframing. As you were talking, I picked up the book because I had so many notes in here. I had so many notes. And since we do have a few minutes, thank you, Helen. That was great to bring that up. Another one where I had a lot of stars was the how about a drink? How about a drink? Why did you decide to put a whole chapter on that?
Well, because dehydration is such a biggie. And, I remember taking Dad to the doctor one day and they were trying to draw blood and they couldn't draw blood. And, we're like, he probably hadn't had enough to drink. And I'm started thinking, it's like, oh my gosh, I bet he hasn't. Did you drink this? No, I wasn't thirsty this morning. And so we had to go in the other room and it's like, drink more water. And he's like, no, that's okay. I'm not thirsty. It's like, Dad, we're going to be here forever. But it wasn't just with my dad. It was, my mom, I had this issue and I hear it all the time in support groups. And it's always about pushing water, which we need to think about pushing fluids. But the other thing is, you know, I wanted families to understand all the implications. It's not just that we need to drink water to be healthier, but for an older person, it's going to prevent constipation. It's going to help them function better. It's going to help them think better. I mean, it's just so important. And yet there are so many reasons why older people don't want to drink water. And it's just like this battle and trying to figure out ways to work around it because it is so very important. And the how about a little drink, I don't know, or whatever it was. I did have a good time. And you mentioned to somebody about reading the chapter about a heartfelt apology, maybe starting there. That was one of the things I did very intentionally with the book is had it so that all the chapters stood alone and a family member could pick up the book and read any chapter that kind of hit their fancy or that maybe struck a chord. They could read it in any order that they wanted it to, but also knowing that some of the chapters, if they knew what the chapter was going to be truly about, they probably would just skip over it because it wasn't a problem and in their mind maybe never would be a problem. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to maybe instill a little bit of curiosity that they might explore and accidentally be pleasantly surprised, hopefully pleasantly. So yeah.
I like it because it really, you can either read it straight through because there's a story, or you can pick a chapter because it's a resource. Because just looking at the one on drinking, you give these great ideas about, because you said it's not just water, it's fluids. Well, soup is a fluid. Are we stopping to think about using soup as a fluid? That's great. And with the few minutes we've got left, and then of course, if you've got questions, please put them in. We talked about this before. If they can walk, they can
wonder.
Tell us about that. And again, the titles, the titles of your chapters. So,
well, that was one of my earlier chapters that I wrote, and just kind of off the subject, but on the subject. I wrote all the chapters freestanding, and then I had them spread out each chapter on the dining room table. So I put them in order so there would be a little bit shorter, a little bit longer, and that they wouldn't be quite the same thing. But when I wrote that chapter, I was really kind of struggling because I wanted the chapters to be no more than maybe 3 or 4 pages long, and I couldn't contain it. And I was telling my husband, I said, this is just such a big deal. It's always been like a soapbox subject for me. And I said, it's just like that lady that got lost at the Dallas Fort Worth airport. And my husband said, what lady? I said, you remember a few years ago? No, he didn't. So I was Googling because I couldn't remember how far. I was Googling lady with dementia lost at airport. There were like 7 pages full of people around the world who have got with dementia who have become lost at an airport. And of course, her story was very unhappy because I think they found body parts several years later that they believe were identified as hers. But it's just such a big deal, and families would never read that chapter because they're always like, well, it hasn't happened yet, or my husband doesn't wander. And I always say, your husband, your mom, they don't wander until the day they do. And then that's why we see the silver alert signs almost every single day. It's like there's not a problem with them driving until there is a problem, and they're big problems. But just, the families that know, or they have a tendency, or they've cared for someone once before, they have all kinds of systems in place to kind of prevent it or to minimize the chance. But so many families just think it's not an issue because it's not an issue today.
Right, right. And I think for us to be able to tell the stories and to say things like, this isn't something someone made up. There's 7 pages. Like you said, I was looking for a story. I found dozens of stories.
Yeah.
This is real. And whenever we can, I've been told that many times too, but they're only going back and forth to the post office, to the McDonald's until they don't, or
Yes.
until they run over. I had this happen with a family member, the fire hydrant in the parking lot of the McDonald's. Well, what else is the size of a fire hydrant? Let's think here. So I love it. I love that you included those. Has anybody put anything in the Q&A? Do we have anybody that would like to ask any questions of Pam?
I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now. So yes, definitely. If anyone has a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat. I did have another question. I have a comment about what y'all were just talking about, and then also a question, which I have to say that I really loved the usage of the quotes in this book. I thought you did a really good job like sprinkling those in there. I thought they were great, sort of like, and in terms of the metaphor that you used with, I think it was the quote that you used on that chapter, but if not, it still applies because it was really good. And the quote that you used was that like Noah didn't build the ark when it was raining. And I thought that was a great metaphor because it's like this idea that, in a sense, yes, you have to be grateful for what you have, but also balance that with planning that, things might not be happening right now, but they are heading in that direction, whether you like it or not. So I think that's such a tricky balance, and that must be so difficult for people to navigate. But I thought that was a great metaphor to illustrate that. And then you were kind of getting into this a little bit in the conversation a minute ago, which I know we kind of talked about this when we were doing our prep call for this, which is, kind of why you created this book, how you did, so that someone could just, pick it up and say, okay, well, I'm going to read this. And it's like, you don't have to go, cover to cover, and just the idea of the whole guidebook format. And there is a section in here, I can't seem to find it right now, but there is a section in here where you talk about, your tips for caregivers and the different ways that the caregivers can kind of help, take care of themselves so that they can take care of other people. And I think, and I thought earlier when you were talking about how, you sort of stopped and took a minute for yourself to remember to be grateful that at least he can still walk. And I think that was really interesting because the other purpose of you taking that moment was to kind of like recenter yourself as well. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about some of your advice for caregivers on how to take care of themselves.
Well, I think we've talked a little bit about it, and in that we've talked about kind of the importance and what's going to happen if they don't. But finding those minutes, taking that time. We talked about laughter, and it's not just, intentionally seeking out something that is funny, looking up a stupid knock knock joke every day, or maybe calling, maybe having that be kind of responsibility of a grandchild. It's like, can you write some funny jokes or riddles, for grandma? Because I need lots of laughter in my life, whatever it might be. Caregivers are always so quick to, they'll walk to the ends of the earth for the person they're caring for, but they're so bad about not taking time for themselves, and it goes back to this, how I'm fine. But it doesn't have to be like the afternoon off to go have lunch with the girls and have a movie. It could be just setting aside 10 minutes a day to listen to music, to read something, to take a bubble bath, to for me, I started getting up at 5:30 in the morning because I had to have some quiet time, to have my cup of coffee with no one talking to me, and to do my devotional. That was very, very important to me. I was not jumping with joy about getting up at 5:30 in the morning. I was not a morning person before my dad came into my life. But again, I think it became one of my lifelines, because once I started my day like that, it gave me more time. I couldn't stay up after we went to bed because dad would never go to bed or sleep until I did. And honestly, I could turn out the lights and I could still hear him talking just to himself and just mumbling and whatever. Sometimes, family members will say, well, using respite is one thing. Doing exercise, taking walks, the two of them taking a walk together or going to the gym together. And it doesn't have to be a membership. It can go down to the city recreation thing. And even if you just walked around or did something together, doing a sit-exercise in front of the TV together, if you can't do that separately. Just and thinking about something that for caregivers that they really, really miss, and then figuring out a way to make that happen. Maybe it's something they used to do once a week, and maybe the only way they can figure out is to do it once a month. But to recognize that they are very, very important. Because if something happens to them, who is going to take care of your loved one? And if you ask him, do you want to be sweet and kind and loving as a caregiver? Oh, there's no as they look at you like that's such a stupid question. Of course I do. But when you feel irritated and grumpy, that grumpy, they can hear that grumpy in your voice. So if you can do things that make you happy and kind of joyful, they will hear that in your voice. They will see that in your actions. So everything you do for yourself is going to make you care for that person you love better. You can do a better job. And if you think about it like that, you're doing it for them. It's just that you start with you, but it ends up being for them too.
Yeah, it helps everybody. Yeah. Okay. So on that note, I know, Hollie, you were showing us your t-shirt at the beginning of the call. Could you just show everyone your t-shirt again?
Yes, please.
Therapist, I'll be there for you.
Yes.
I'm a licensed counselor, and is that not the best?
That is the best.
Yeah. Therapist, I'll be there for you. Therapy, it's a good thing. And now people can do online therapy, and to truly get in a support group, what a difference it makes when families. I had a gentleman explain it this way this past Wednesday on our Wednesday group, and he's just recently placed his wife, and he said, it's like I'm out here in the middle of the ocean and I'm floating, and I just don't know that either I'm going to be swept under or I might just decide to go under. And here comes this raft, and it's my support group.
Yeah.
And there's all of us, and we're holding on to that raft, and we're all in this together. Oh my goodness. I don't usually cry in group, but that day I was wow. Because I've got a group of people that I can say anything. Nobody's going to judge me.
Everybody needs that safe environment. And even a best friend is not the same as saying something and sharing in a support group. Because a best friend knows you, but they don't understand if they're not walking the walk. That's why it was very important to me to have to speak on the importance of support groups in the book. Because so many people that say, I don't want to do a support group or I don't like them, they've never even been to one, or they went to one that had 3 people and 2 of the people were crying the whole time. Yeah. It's like, that was just the wrong one. But there's not anything better than support group. No book, no video, no anything. There's nothing better than a good support group.
Or they've been to, because a lot of people hear support group and they think 12-step program.
Yes.
And so when I'm talking about groups, I always say, and I try to use a lot of humor. I sandwich. We're going to laugh. We're probably going to cry, but we're going to laugh again at the end. But I'll tell them, we will never go around the room and say, hello, my name is, and I'm A. There's a time and place for that. 12-step programs are fantastic. I'm a huge believer. I used to run them myself. That's not what this is.
Right.
Not what this is. We know why you're here. We're here with you. And it's really almost, I will have support group members say it's an educational support group. I learned so much just from hearing other people. And I've got people who never talk, but they come back week after week after week.
Well, and that's what I always tell families, if they're not going to a support group, if I talk to someone and I'll say, are you attending support group? No, not yet. And I tell them, you need to find one, and just know that you don't have to say anything. You don't have to share. You have to just show up and just listen, and you will gain so much out of going. And knowing once they get there, they'll probably say a few things here and there. But even if they just listen, it's that realization. It's like, oh my gosh, other people are having this too. Other people are getting upset or annoyed. Other people are making mistakes. And, I think that message that the best caregiver in the whole world still makes mistakes, still wishes they had do-overs. Yeah.
So as we come up here at the top of the hour, so far it sounds like
Wow.
key takeaways. Yeah, time flies when you're having fun,
fun.
learning a lot, for sure. So takeaways, the book again is Did I Remember to Tell You? Any brief closing thoughts or advice other than join a support group and read this book? Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. A little closing note here. That TALA Next has coming up our monthly TALA Hour event on Friday the 23rd. I'm going to drop the link to register here in the chat. You can also find it at tala.org underneath our calendar option on the menu on the homepage. You can also find it on any of our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We're really looking forward to that. We're going to have 12 Oaks, the operator, with us, as well as August Health, industry partner, and talk about their collaboration about different partnerships to offer different types of care and value to residents. So that's going to be a really insightful event. We're really looking forward to that. Thank you so much again, Hollie from James L. West Center for Dementia Care, Pam Kovacs Johnson, Texas-based author, and it sounds like there's another book coming soon. So who knows, maybe we'll see you all again soon for another TALABook. If anyone would like to reach out to either Pam or Hollie after today's event, you can reach out to the TALA team. You can reach out to myself. I'll put my email here in the chat, and we'd be happy to connect with you or connect you all together. And you can also find the TALA team contact information on our website underneath. Stay connected and contact us. Okay, so with that, thank you so much again, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye.